In a quiet institute devoted to words and wisdom, 4 elements, spiral, flame, wine, and water, became the blueprint for a series of elegant, symbolic deaths. Beneath the solemn rituals and flickering candlelight, a doctrine twisted into murder, and one brilliant mind had to untangle philosophy from guilt. You're about to step into a world where silence conceals lineage and every shadow hides a name unspoken. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was a grey Monday in late January, the sort of day that drapes itself over New York like a damp overcoat. I was in the office reorganizing Wolfe's correspondence according to a system only I understood and he routinely ignored when the phone rang with the low, purring insistence of someone who didn't plan to hang up. "Goodwin," I said, as if I expected someone interesting. The voice on the other end was cultivated and a little brittle. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe this afternoon, in person." I glanced at the clock. "You'll have better luck with St. Peter. This is Elspeth Kahn." The name gave me a reason to sit forward. Old money, older influence. Widow of Bertram Kahn, the scholar mystic, who'd founded the Sanctuary of the Word, a place people went to meditate or misbehave depending on which column you read. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't generally." "He will," she said. "Tell him it concerns the 7th candle." I don't usually pass along cryptic messages, but something about her tone, urgent but dignified, like a violin string drawn too tight, made me set the phone down and head upstairs. By 3 o'clock, the brownstone's front bell chimed, and I opened the door to a gust of cold air and a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a higher-priced century. She wore sable, not the dyed kind, and perfume that cost more than most of my suits. Her eyes were shadowed, but not tired. They watched like she was waiting for the floor to give way. "I'm Elspeth Kahn." "You'd be no one else," I said, stepping back. She entered the front room with the ease of someone born to rooms like ours. But when I gestured to Wolfe's favourite chair, the wide one with the ottoman stationed like a loyal foot soldier, she hesitated, then chose the corner chair instead. That gave me my first itch. Wolfe, already seated behind his desk, barely lifted his gaze from the orchid catalogue he'd been pretending not to read. "Mrs. Kahn." She didn't smile. "Mr. Wolfe, thank you for seeing me." "I have not yet," he said. That line usually sets the tempo. This time she didn't even blink. "I need you to attend a ceremony." Wolfe closed the catalogue. Slowly. "The 7th candle," she said. "It's a private rite we hold annually at the Sanctuary of the Word. It honors Bertram's legacy. Only a handful of people are permitted to attend." Wolfe made a small noise, not unlike a man offered soup after declining dinner. "This concerns murder?" he asked. "Not exactly," she said. "But I believe someone is planning something disruptive." "Disruptive?" She nodded once. "Symbolically, possibly fatally. Archie Goodwin, that's me, does not consider possibly a strong enough forecast to justify Wolfe's participation in anything that doesn't involve veal. But she had him curious now. You could tell by the angle of his head. "Have there been threats?" Nothing overt. Just a convergence of signs. Dreams. Portents. Blood on the moon. "I'm not superstitious," she said. "But I do know pattern, and there's a pattern emerging." Wolfe pressed his fingertips together. "You believe someone will use the ceremony to exact revenge or make a statement?" She did not confirm, but she didn't deny it either. "I need you present," she said. "Your presence alone might deter them." Wolfe glanced at me, and I met his look with the bland expression I keep for bad ideas on silver trays. She opened her handbag, black leather, antique clasp, and removed a slim envelope. Inside was a certified check. The amount, when I glanced at it later, was enough to cover a month of Fritz's groceries and still leave room for a decent burgundy. "You will not be asked to investigate," she said. "Only to observe. You may report your impressions afterward if you wish." Wolfe frowned. "You seek a presence, not a mind. I seek deterrence, not interpretation. That is unorthodox. It is necessary." Wolfe leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across the vast landscape of his stomach. "Mrs. Khan, I do not lend myself as ornament, nor would I ask you to." She folded the envelope back into her gloves. "But if you decline, I will find someone less capable, and if something does occur, you will have passed on the opportunity to prevent it." It was an ugly sentence, dressed up in good diction. Wolfe hated coercion, but he hated wasted architecture even more, and this mystery had all the frame and none of the windows. "I will consider it," he said, and from Wolfe that was practically a promissory note. As I showed her to the door, a task I often consider ceremonial in itself, I noticed she hadn't put the envelope back into her handbag. Instead, she'd tucked it beneath a small green journal bound in worn leather, just large enough to house private thoughts or inconvenient names. I held out her coat, and she thanked me absently. Her fingers closed over the journal as though it were an extension of her spine. "Interesting color," I offered, casually. She gave me a glance polished with amusement. "Old habit. I write reflections." "Like a diary?" "More like a map," she said. Then, realizing she'd said more than she meant, she changed tone. "It's private." I assumed. I opened the door. She stepped out, and I watched her cross the icy steps with the posture of someone who'd learned to balance grace over guilt. When I returned to the office, Wolfe hadn't moved. "She has concealed something vital," he said. "Most people do." "She clutches a book she will not open," he murmured. "Symbolically, that's always dangerous." I didn't argue. We'd both seen it. The question was, what was she protecting? A memory or a name? Once she was gone, Wolfe rose, stretched the complaint from his shoulders, and walked, to the globe in the corner, giving it a mild spin as if he expected it to offer an opinion. He stared at it while he spoke. "She fears something specific, but will not articulate it. That suggests she lacks proof, or courage." I nodded, filing that under Insight number 347. "You think she's wrong?" "Number, I think she's late." He returned to his chair with the sort of economy that implies calories are at stake. I leaned against the edge of my desk, not taking notes, but thinking like I should be. "She wants protection," I said. "But she won't say from whom or what." Wolfe lifted a brow. "The best lies are not told, they're implied." I started to ask what he thought the pattern might be, but he beat me to it. "Either she fears a ghost," he said, "or she shelters a murderer." It wasn't just flair, it was fact. One or the other, and possibly both, had already found a way into our brownstone, and neither would leave without lighting the match first. The Sanctuary of the Word stood just off Gramercy Park, tucked between a Protestant church with peeling paint and a bakery that did more whispering than baking. Its brownstone exterior was scrubbed clean, polished to a reflective gleam that said, "We have nothing to hide," which in my experience is usually a lie, with expensive shoes. Inside it smelled like sandalwood and linen-bound volumes, the kind you're not supposed to open unless your name ends in PhD, or your check has cleared. A receptionist with eyebrows drawn like question marks handed me a guest badge and murmured that the pre-ceremony reception was just through there. The room beyond looked like a cocktail party hosted by the ghost of Henry James. Everyone was speaking softly, as if the walls had ears, and which they probably did. There were velvet chairs arranged in deliberate asymmetry, and soft music that had the decency not to impose. The air was warm, but not friendly. I moved in like I belonged, which is easier when you suspect most of the people around you aren't sure they do. Julian Khan was the first to spot me, which was impressive, considering he was already 2 bourbons deep and staring at nothing in particular. He had the kind of good looks that hadn't aged well, cheekbones now used to clenching, and eyes that expected to be obeyed, even when they weren't sure why. "Press?" he asked, and when I said no, he smiled like someone who'd just found a smaller enemy. "Then what are you?" "I'm the observer," I said, which wasn't a lie. Wolfe hadn't authorized that phrase, but it fit the suit. "Figures," he muttered, then turned away with a bored shrug, as if that settled me. Irene Vaughn floated past next, dark lipstick, pale silk, and the air of a woman who lit her own matches and watched others burn. She paused beside me, as if weighing my temperature, then smiled with something just shy of warmth. "You're not part of the faithful," she said. "Number, I'm part of the curious." "That's worse," she whispered, and moved on. The final act came courtesy of Dr. Horace Brill, who had the spine of a monk and the voice of a sermon. He took my elbow, gently but with purpose. "You must understand," he said, "the ritual is about purification. The 7th candle, well, we'll speak later." I didn't ask him to clarify. Men who offer mystery like candy usually bite. The hush that followed the sudden opening of a side door was not deliberate, but total, the kind that ripples without permission. Everyone turned. A slim woman stepped out, clad in grey, her face pale and smooth as porcelain, left too long in shadow. "Prudence Khan," she said nothing. Her eyes passed over the room like a traveller looking for an exit, and when they landed on Julian, something flickered. Recognition, maybe. Or resignation. She stepped forward, paused beside the fireplace, then turned on her heel and vanished through another door. No one followed. No one even whispered. I moved a step closer to the spot she'd vacated. The silence had left a trace. Not grief exactly, but a sort of residual fragility, like a glass that hadn't shattered yet, but remembered how. Irene appeared at my shoulder, softer now. "She doesn't attend the ceremonies," she murmured. "Only the anniversaries." "Anniversary of what?" I asked. But she was already drifting away, scent trailing like punctuation. I was studying a tray of canapés that looked more artistic than edible when I caught 2 voices. Male, brittle, pitched just low enough to indicate intent. "6 in 6 years, one said. "Doesn't that count as something?" "Accidents," said the other. "None of it was connected." I kept still, not pretending to eavesdrop because I was doing it on purpose. "Still," the first man continued, "each winter, each just before the ritual. Don't be dramatic. 1 stroke, 1 fall, 2 heart attacks. You can't thread that needle." "You can, if the eye is guilt." They moved on before I could assign names to faces. I made a mental note and helped myself to the canapé that had suffered most from neglect. It tasted like dill and possible litigation. Later, I found Wolfe's voice in my head, as he often is when mystery scratches at the margins. "Pattern, Archie, is the mind's only antidote to chaos." I didn't have a full pattern yet, but I had numbers. 6. 6 who died, 6 years. 6 shadows cast before the 7th candle had a chance to flicker. Dr. Brill found me again near the library shelves where the books wore gold lettering and the air was heavier with intention. "You saw her?" he asked. I assumed he meant Prudence. I nodded. "She was never meant for the world," he said. "Too delicate, too much blood in her mind." That wasn't a metaphor I wanted expanded. He took a breath and straightened his cuffs like preparing for a lecture no one had requested. 7 is sacred, 7 is structure. We are born in blood and shaped by ritual. The founder understood that. "Bertram Kahn?" I asked. "A brilliant man, flawed, but brilliant." "And now you're his apostle?" He didn't blink. "The Institute preserves his vision, but vision without discipline becomes poison." "I'm just here to observe," I said mildly. "That's what the 7th candle does," he replied, voice softening into reverence. "It observes us. 1 for each wound, each trial. When the 7th burns, we begin again." He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment I had the absurd sensation of being measured for spiritual fabric. I excused myself before he could hand me a robe. I waited until most of the guests had migrated toward wine and philosophy before slipping into the ceremonial chamber. It was smaller than expected, domed like a chapel and lined with panels etched in what I assumed was sacred geometry. The air was still, not stale, just expectant. The altar stood at the far end, an elegant block of black stone with 7 candle holders arranged in a precise arc. 6 of them stood empty, awaiting their moment. The 7th, the one furthest right, already held a candle. Thick, ivory, half melted. That was wrong. No one had lit anything yet. The ceremony was scheduled for the following evening, but wax had spilled in lazy rivulets, and the wick was singed black. I crouched to study it. The wax hadn't dripped uniformly. It had followed a spiral path, small, deliberate, etched into the stone. I didn't touch it. You don't put your fingers on something that's already decided to burn. I left the room quieter than I entered, the silence folding behind me like a book someone had shut too quickly. Fritz had outdone himself with the eggs. Soft scrambled with herbes de Provence and a side of tomatoes, broiled to within an inch of surrender. Wolfe had already cleaned his plate, which was not unusual for a Tuesday, but the angle of his fork suggested deeper irritation than usual. "She is lying," he said, not looking up. I buttered a crescent of toast. Most clients are, eventually. "She lies not from self-interest," he went on, "but from obligation, a distinction worth noting." I chewed and watched him over the rim of my coffee. When he eats quickly and speaks slowly, something is crawling up his spine. Elspeth Khan has knowledge she considers unmentionable. That makes her dangerous. To herself? To others, he replied. Summon her. You want me to call and politely request she return to the scene of the suspicion? Number Y want you to summon her, he said flatly. Without pleasantries. There was a pause, then, tell her that if she fails to appear, I will withdraw my participation and draft a memorandum to Inspector Kramer. That should suffice. It would, especially coming from the one man in Manhattan Kramer loathed taking favors from. She arrived by 11, wearing the same gloves but not the same composure. I met her at the door and skipped my usual charm. Wolfe had specified no pleasantries, and I follow instructions best when I agree with them. Wolfe didn't stand, he didn't offer tea. He looked at her as if she had appeared uninvited, and in a sense, she had. You believe someone intends to kill, he said. You believe it because someone already has. She opened her mouth, closed it, and adjusted the clasp on her handbag. I cannot. You must, Wolfe interrupted with a steel edge. You came not for protection, but to absolve yourself of complicity without confession. That is intolerable. Her shoulders stiffened. Then she lowered herself into the chair she had refused 2 days before. There have been 6 deaths, she said quietly. Each occurred within a week of the annual ceremony. Some were staff, others were guests, all peripheral. Peripheral to whom? To Bertram. Your husband, she nodded. Each of them had, at one time or another, served as facilitators of his work, or of his secrets? She didn't answer, which was an answer. I think someone is finishing what Bertram never dared. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, and for a moment I thought he was going to dismiss her. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to speak. Not to her, not to me, but to the room, which is how he addresses time when it becomes his ally. 6 deaths, 6 winters, each in proximity to the ceremonial lighting of the 7th candle. No charges filed, no foul play officially acknowledged, yet Mrs. Khan arrives here certain that a 7th is planned. He opened his eyes and fixed her with a look that could curdle varnish. Was there a 7th victim intended in years prior, who escaped? I don't know, she said. Wolfe made a dismissive grunt. Then I must assume the pattern is numeric, not personal, ritualistic. He turned to me. Archie, retrieve from the bookshelf behind you Glimpses of a Hidden Order, 2nd volume, Kahn's monographs on numeric liturgy. I handed it over and he flipped through with speed that implied prior intimacy. Here, he said, tapping a page, 7 elements, 7 purifications, fire, wine, smoke, water, not metaphors, steps. He turned back to Elspeth. Your ceremony is not commemorative, it is sacrificial. She didn't flinch, but her silence screamed. With Wolfe chewing on metaphysics, it fell to me to chase down something more tangible. I had a hunch about Roger Trillman. Not a full theory, just that prickling sense that a man that quiet isn't always clean. A discreet call to Lon Cohen turned up something that hadn't made the papers, but had left smudges in old ledgers. About a decade ago, Trillman had been employed as financial liaison for the Institute. In plain English, that meant he moved money around and answered no questions. Apparently, one year, a donor fund meant for a special symposium had gone missing. Nothing flashy, just quietly unavailable, no public scandal, no charges. But 3 staffers were let go and Trillman was sent on sabbatical, which in non-profit language is a polite shove toward the fire escape. I found a former board member, retired, talkative, suspiciously fond of gin, who confirmed that Elspeth had personally intervened to keep the matter internal. Did you ever ask her why? I inquired. She said it was to protect Bertram's reputation, he replied, then chuckled. Which was ironic, considering Bertram's reputation could have used a little damage. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the clouds had lowered, and so had my opinion of everyone involved. When I returned, Wolfe was mid-discourse with himself, a process that sounds like debate but is really just arrangement. I handed him what I had on Trillman, and he tucked it away with no comment, which meant it had met his expectations or failed to surprise him. Mrs. Kahn has constructed a fortress of restraint, he said, and peopled it with loyalists too fractured to rebel. Irene's not the loyal type, I said. She talks like a saboteur who hasn't quite decided who to blow up. And Julian? He asked. Fuming, wants to be rid of it all, but hasn't figured out how to turn the wreckage into inheritance. He nodded once. Murder is rarely born of impulse. It is built, brick by brick, shadow by shadow. And you think we're circling the final stone? I think, Wolfe said, eyes narrowing, the architect is nearly finished. I don't always check my watch before heading to bed, but that night I did. It was 3 minutes past midnight when something nudged my instincts, not a sound, not a flash, just that quiet hum that told me the house was too quiet. The library was dark except for the sliver of light spilling from beneath the side door. I opened it slowly. Prudence Kahn sat on the floor, knees drawn up like a child, her hair hanging forward like drapery no one had tied back. Her hands were folded around something charred and crumbling, the green journal, only it wasn't green anymore. The leather was scorched, the edges curled, the spine still held, barely, but the pages had blackened in a way that wasn't accidental. I crouched beside her. Prudence. She didn't flinch. Her lips were moving, but no sound came. I lifted the book gently. It was warm, like it hadn't been entirely finished burning. One corner was legible. January, light returns to those who look away. I looked at her again. Her eyes were dry, but hollowed out. She hadn't set the fire to destroy the truth. She'd done it because she already knew it, and maybe because she couldn't carry it alone anymore. Getting Wolfe out of the brownstone requires an alignment of planets, a suspension of principle, and at least one non-refundable insult to dignity. He considers most excursions undignified by default. This one, he informed me, was barbaric. Attending ritual for deterrence, he grumbled, is like drinking vinegar to avoid vinegar. Nonsense begets nonsense. Nevertheless, at 5:30 sharp, Fritz zipped him into a tailored overcoat like a diplomat in exile. We made it to the Institute with time to spare and pride intact, give or take half an inch of snow on his collar and the usual public disdain for mass transit. The building had been rearranged for the ceremony, dimmed lighting, floral arrangements with theological aspirations, and soft music that was trying too hard not to be Gregorian. Wolfe paused in the vestibule, sniffed the air, and muttered, "Patchouli and conceit." I led him to a reserved seat in the front row, between Elspeth Khan and a bronze sculpture of Bertram himself. Wolfe did not sit. He settled, in the way glaciers settle, with reluctance and consequence. He did not speak again for 10 minutes. But I've seen him like this before, unmoving, unreadable, yet conducting a silent orchestra of calculation. By the time the lights dimmed, I had the distinct impression that the ritual wasn't the only thing about to be dissected. The hall filled slowly with that quiet tension particular to the culturally devout and the socially unsure. The guests moved in muted tones, no whispers, just murmurs, as though sound itself might tarnish the sanctity of the occasion. Elspeth stood at the head of the altar, hands folded like a woman posing for an oil portrait. She was dressed in black satin with a high collar and no jewelry. The room fell silent as she raised her voice, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that expects to be obeyed without repetition. "We gather this year," she intoned, "as we have each year since the passing of Bertram Khan, to renew our what was left unfinished." Wolfe's eyebrows twitched. "Each candle," she continued, "marks not only remembrance but offering. Flame as witness, flame as promise." The first 6 candles were lit by various members of the Institute's inner circle, one by one, each after a solemn phrase: reflection, trial, offering, confession, path, binding. The 7th remained untouched. Wolfe's gaze moved from the candles to the faces. He wasn't listening to the words. He was observing the weight they carried. Julian Khan's eyes darted. Irene looked bored, and Dr. Brill was mouthing the invocations under his breath like a man with something to atone for. By the time Elspeth reached the final phrase, completion, Wolfe had closed his eyes, not in reverence, but in readiness. The room held its breath as the 7th candle was lit. The match hissed softly, then caught with a brief blue flick before surrendering to gold. The wick flared, and the shadows on the wall deepened, lengthening into shapes no one dared name. Julian Khan raised his wineglass, not in toast, not in respect, but like a man trying to reclaim relevance by making noise. "To the end of false beginnings," he said, voice slurred just enough to cast doubt on his convictions. The flame danced. A hush stretched thinner. Then it happened. A gasp, sharp, guttural, escaped Julian's throat. His glass slipped from his hand, struck the stone floor, and shattered with a sound that did not echo so much as hang in the air, like a question. Julian staggered, one hand to his chest, the other flailing for balance that would not come. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. No plea, no curse, no absolution. His knees gave first, then the rest of him followed, folding gracelessly to the floor. A woman screamed. Someone gasped. Irene backed into a wall. Kramer wasn't there yet, but his presence was suddenly very much missed. Wolfe did not move. He did not blink. "Elspeth," he said, low and calm, "instruct them not to touch the body." Elspeth, to her credit, obeyed. I knelt beside Julian. His pulse had already packed up and left. His eyes stared at nothing with the certainty of a man who had seen something too late. Wolfe exhaled through his nose, not heavily, precisely. "It is no longer deterrence," he said. "It is design." The moment Wolfe's voice cut through the commotion, it changed the room's geometry. People had been scrambling in slow motion, gasping, stepping back, whispering with increasing volume. But Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Seal the doors," he said to Elspeth, as if he were asking for salt. "No one leaves." There was a pause, a hesitation, filled with the rustling of silk, the scrape of a heel, the twitch of someone calculating whether defiance was worth the spectacle. Then Elspeth nodded, and Roger Trillman moved like a man who had practiced obedience in worse rooms than this. I took the liberty of securing the side entrances, locking one with a brass latch and blocking another with a coat rack that wouldn't stop a determined moose, but would give me a head start. Inside, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just shock now, it was containment, like someone had put a bell jar over the room, and the oxygen knew it. Irene was pacing in measured lines near the wall, Julian's glass still in pieces beside his collapsed form. Dr. Brill sat down, finally, staring not at the body, but at the flame that continued to burn as if death were its proper context. Wolfe hadn't moved. He looked at me and murmured, "Observe without engaging." Grief is no more honest in velvet. I nodded. The hunt had begun and the wolves were inside the circle. It took just under 17 minutes for the cavalry to arrive, and as usual, it arrived growling. Inspector Kramer entered the chamber like a man who'd been promised quiet and got a grenade instead. He was red-faced, coat open, cigar clamped between teeth with enough pressure to register a protest from the tobacco. "What the hell have you done?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "You call me out of a poker game, I get here to find a body on the floor, and Nero Wolfe playing funeral director." "I called you," I said mildly. He turned on Wolfe. "You want to tell me why you're here instead of on your throne with your orchids?" "I came to witness," Wolfe replied. "And unfortunately, I witnessed." Kramer crouched beside Julian's body, scowling. "You didn't touch him." "I do not examine corpses," Wolfe said. "I observe the living." "He just collapsed? Heart attack?" "No." Wolfe's tone was flat, not sharp, not smug, just factual, which is when you know he's loading the first round. Kramer's cigar paused in mid-chew. Wolfe went on. "The death was not spontaneous. It was prepared. The ritual was the mechanism, not the backdrop." Kramer stood, slowly. "You're saying this was staged?" "I am saying it was inevitable." He didn't like that. Kramer never enjoys being a chapter behind, but he also knew better than to ignore Wolfe when he started setting the tempo. The orchestra was tuning. While Kramer continued barking into a notebook and Wolfe settled into his posture of deliberate immobility, I took the liberty of kneeling beside Julian's body again, this time with a sharper lens. Something had bothered me about the fall, beyond the obvious. His sleeve had caught my eye earlier, mostly because it was too pristine. No stain, no fold. But now, under the light from the candle overhead, I noticed it. A faint residue, slightly glossy, curling just above the cufflink, like the path of a snail in moonlight. I shifted position. The spiral revealed itself, not random, not smudged, formed, wax mark, tiny, precise, spiral-shaped. I didn't touch it. Wolfe's voice was still in my head, telling me that clues deserve reverence until reason arrives, but I leaned in close enough to smell the trace of beeswax. "Wolfe," I said softly. He was marked. "With wax?" Wolfe opened his eyes. "Spiral?" he asked. I nodded. He closed them again. "So, not merely a symbol, then," he said, almost to himself. "A sequence." The pattern, whatever it was, had just crossed the threshold from spiritual metaphor to physical fact. And Wolfe never ignored a fact, however scented it might be. Kramer began the interrogations with all the delicacy of a tugboat in a duck pond. He stood, arms folded and cigar smouldering like an accusation, while each guest was summoned to the front of the room and prodded for inconsistencies, alibis, and reactions. The reactions were plentiful, the alibis less so. Julian Kahn was dead, which limited his utility. Irene Varn was evasive in silk, answering with a tone that suggested she was being asked to recall dreams rather than facts. Dr. Brill grew increasingly agitated, bristling at any implication that sacred rites could accommodate secular bloodshed. Roger Trillman spoke only when spoken to and managed to leave no impression stronger than his cologne. Kramer's questions were short and fast. His temper was long but fraying. He hated open rooms with closed mouths. He hated rituals, private clubs, and more than anything, he hated being forced to cooperate with Nero Wolfe in front of an audience. Wolfe, for his part, sat a few feet away from the makeshift tribunal, arms folded across his chest and eyes closed in what might have looked like indifference, but was more likely strategic filtration. I've seen him do it in a courtroom and in a greenhouse. When the noise gets excessive, he listens not to content, but to rhythm. By the time Kramer had growled through the last name on his list, Wolfe had still not spoken, but I noticed a slight motion, the tip of his index finger twitching once, twice, like a tuning fork waiting to strike pitch. After Kramer had finished venting and the guests had scattered like reluctant moths, Wolfe opened his eyes, tilted his head toward me, and murmured, "Trillman." The name hung there, not as a question, but as a cue. "What about him?" I asked. "There's a misalignment," Wolfe said. "His composure is too practiced, and Elspeth Khan trusts him with details but not disclosure. That's either a lapse of judgment or an indication of leverage. Blackmail? Possibly. More likely, complicity followed by immunity." I waited. "I want his employment records from the Institute," Wolfe said, "especially those that were abbreviated." "Abbreviated?" Wolfe lifted a brow. "If the ledger tells the truth, it will not be because it was designed to." "Got it. You want the gaps, not the pages." "Precisely. The periods where no reason was given and none required." He waved a hand as if dismissing a fly. "Do not engage him. I want paper, not posture." "Understood." He leaned back, closed his eyes again, and added, "There is a thread. I've felt it since the moment Elspeth Khan refused to name what frightened her. It passes through Trillman." "That's not much to hang a theory on," I said. "No," Wolfe replied. "But sometimes the absence of motive is the strongest evidence of opportunity." Which was his way of saying, find the dust they've swept under the rug. The footprints may no longer show, but the indentations remain. The Institute's administrative office was locked, but not secure. A brief exchange with the receptionist, who had the type of loyalty that expires under pressure and the promise of plausible deniability, got me inside with minimal drama and exactly 0 signatures. Trillman's files were kept in a lateral cabinet labelled Fiscal 1989 to 2002, which sounded innocent enough until you noticed that it was the only drawer with a handwritten label and a lock that had been picked and relocked enough times to round its edges. Inside, buried between program budgets and donor acknowledgement lists, was a narrow envelope tucked into a file marked Maintenance Disbursements, Restricted. The envelope had no name, just a set of initials. IV. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the implication wasn't. Inside was a ledger page, neatly typed, dated, unremarkable, unless you noticed the pattern. A monthly payment, always the same amount, drawn from discretionary funds labelled Event Consultant, non-listed. The recipient, Irene Varn. The last payment had been issued 3 months ago, the first just over a decade back. I replaced the envelope exactly where I'd found it, made a mental snapshot, and left the office quietly. Back at the car, I sat for a moment and considered the implications. It wasn't hush money in the classic sense, it was more nuanced than that. This was the currency of containment, the kind of arrangement that starts as courtesy and curdles into conspiracy, and if Irene had kept silent for that long, it wasn't for free. Dr. Brill didn't answer when I asked if he'd ever seen a spiral wax imprint at the Institute before. He blinked once, then again, then tilted his head like a man trying to remember whether a dream was his or someone else's. Wolfe, of course, was not interested in dreams. "Dr. Brill," he said, "you speak often of the sanctity of sequence. I would like you to explain what a spiral means within your framework." Brill's lips parted, then shut. When they opened again, it wasn't hesitation that came out. It was confession dressed as scholarship. "In many esoteric rites," he said quietly, "the spiral represents refinement through recurrence, the repetition of trial, inward movement toward a final flame." Wolfe's eyelids flicked. And the seventh flame? Completion. The extinguishing of excess, ritual cleansing. His voice grew thinner. The founder believed the seventh flame must pass through sacrifice. Literal sacrifice? I asked. Brill's hands fluttered. No, yes. I mean, symbolically. The idea was not to condone violence, but to represent transcendence. Wolfe's voice was flat. Someone has confused metaphor with instruction. Brill paled. I would never advocate. No, Wolfe said. You would merely describe, and some minds take description as design. That was enough to silence him. But in that silence, something settled. The sense that we were no longer reading the script of a ceremony. We were watching it interpreted by someone who believed completion required combustion. We were back in the brownstone by evening, the kind of night Wolfe prefers. Cold outside, warm inside, and no visitors. Fritz brought in duck confit with spiced pear compote, which Wolfe ignored entirely. That was more telling than any outburst. He sat with Kahn's second volume spread open before him and a sheet of yellow notepaper on the table upon which he had drawn a circle, 6 notches, and a central spiral. It is not simply murder, he murmured. It is message. I sat across from him. You're saying the killer sees this as a form of art? Not art, order. He gestured to the page. The Institute was founded on borrowed rights. That was Bertram Kahn's genius. To disguise the devotional as intellectual, to wrap belief in scholarship. And someone's now decided to finish the ritual literally. Correct. I pointed to the notches. 6 deaths, 6 years. If we assume this spiral is a ritual path and the 7th candle marks culmination, Julian's death was the penultimate turn. Wolfe nodded. And the wax spiral? A signature? Number A seal. It affirms that the rite has been fulfilled up to that point. I leaned back. Then we're not done. No, he said. We are at the penumbra, the shadow before the last illumination. That's when the phone rang, a short, crisp chime that usually precedes bills, requests, or bullets. I picked it up, and someone whispered, "You'd better come back." The Institute courtyard was cordoned off when I arrived. Kramer was already there, looking as if he'd chewed glass and found it undercooked. I ducked under the rope and caught the scent before I saw the body. Fountain moss, old water, and the acrid ghost of burnt paper. Roger Trillman was face down in the basin. His suit was rumpled, his hair plastered to one side, and the match was still there, blackened and twisted, cradled in the seam between his lips. A burnt match. Kramer didn't even look at me before growling, "Don't say it." I didn't. But I did notice the water had gone still. No ripples. No disturbance. He hadn't fallen in. He'd been placed. Someone had arranged him with the care of a man, setting the final piece in a clockwork puzzle. And the match, that was no flourish. That was declaration. The 7th flame had not yet been lit, but the second death had claimed its element. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe said nothing when I walked in and handed him the report. He simply reached for the volume of Kahn's essays and drew a line between water and wine. It is progressing, he said, not chaotically, but precisely. And precision, in Wolfe's universe, was never comfort. It was proof. The thing about Wolfe's intellect is that it doesn't chase, it collects, not like a net, but like gravity. Silent, constant, and annoyingly effective. He had spent the better part of the morning buried in the annotated margins of Bertram Kahn's liturgical sequences in symbolic societies, which I had skimmed just long enough to develop an allergy to footnotes. Wolfe, however, treated the book as both scripture and evidence. The spiral is not decorative, he declared. It is initiatory. I nodded as if this clarified anything. He continued, according to Kahn's schema, there are 4 ritual elements: flame, wine, water, and the spiral. They are not independent, they are progressive. Meaning that they mark stages: purification by fire, communion through wine, reflection in water, and the spiral is the map itself, not an act, but a path through which the other elements are interpreted. He leaned back. Julian died after the 7th candle was lit, wine in his glass, flame on the altar, spiral on his cuff. Trillman was found in water. With a burnt match, we are witnessing an execution of liturgy, a choreography of death, which makes the killer what? A literalist, he said, with access to texts never published and a mind unfettered by metaphor. That narrowed the pool, if only by depth rather than breadth. But Wolfe wasn't watching the pool, he was studying the current beneath it. Wolfe detests sending me out for what he calls the fishing expedition, but he detests gaps in symbolic systems even more. So when he set his napkin aside, pressed his palms to the desk and said, "You'll go?" I knew I had won the argument by default, which in our house is how most assignments begin. "Irene Varn," he said, "her apartment. She will not give you anything if you ask for it." That's encouraging. You will not ask, you will observe. Her vanity is architectural. She builds around it, not above it. What am I looking for? Correspondence, he said. Not the official archive, but something personal. Khan's voice, unmediated. You think she kept his letters? I think, Wolfe said, that the only way a woman like Irene Varn stays quiet for 10 years is by placing herself in proximity to something combustible. Blackmail? Number sentiment, he said. But sentiment that knows its worth. And if she says no? She won't, Wolfe said. She will say nothing and leave the drawer unlocked. There's a certain confidence in sending a man to trespass via invitation, but I'd been down that road before. With Irene, you didn't pry. You waited for the curtain to shift. I stood and reached for my coat. Careful, Wolfe added as I opened the door. Always. No, he said dryly. Careful this time. Irene Varn's apartment was a lesson in the art of controlled decay. The books had been dusted but not read. The flowers were silk. Even the air smelled curated, not lived in. She offered me a drink. I declined, and she made no effort to fill the silence. We talked about the Institute, about Elspeth's composure, about Julian's tendency to make noise without meaning. She offered nothing, denied nothing, and smiled just enough to suggest I was being entertained. But somewhere between the line about ritual symbolism and the quote from Blake she half misremembered, I spotted the drawer. A slim brass handle, a scuff mark on the wood below, and the sort of placement that made it invisible unless you were trying not to look at it. She left the room, ostensibly to check on tea, and I checked the drawer. It opened. Inside was a bundle of letters tied in blue ribbon, stained faintly along the edges. The paper was thick, the handwriting firm. The first line began, "My dearest firebrand, forgive the lateness, I've been dreaming again." They were signed B.K. The tone shifted across the pages. Fondness, deepening into hunger, then curdling into remorse. Mentions of a child, of Elspeth, of something that had been quieted for the sake of the Institute. I read just enough to see the shape of guilt and the contours of control. When Irene returned, she said nothing. Neither did I, but we both knew the drawer would not be opened again. The letters, once untied, unfolded not just stories, but scaffolding, the structure beneath the Institute's polite facade, exposed in ink and error. The first half-dozen were what you'd expect from an affair conducted by a man who fancied himself both sage and sinner. Bertram Khan wrote like a philosopher in heat, quoting Rilke, invoking Pythagoras, and slipping between intimacy and abstraction like a man who needed metaphors to apologize. But then came the shift, a dated page, 4 years before his death, no longer addressed my firebrand, but Elspeth, not passion, strategy, not yearning, caution. We were reckless, he wrote, but the Institute cannot absorb another fracture. You know what they'll do if it becomes known. I leave the rest to you. The girl must be protected, even if the truth is not. Elspeth's name was invoked not as muse, but as accomplice. The letters didn't mention the child again, not directly. but the implication was sewn tight. A daughter, born of the affair, hidden with Elspeth's help, for the preservation of Bertram's reputation and legacy. I closed the final page with a sort of numb respect, the kind you feel for a lie so perfectly constructed it doesn't need to be told twice. I left the letters where I found them. Irene said nothing as I nodded and walked out, but her silence had the weight of someone who had always known she wasn't the only woman in the story. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the packet without commentary. He didn't ask. He just opened the ribbon with the kind of reverence he usually reserves for first pressings of rare cookbooks or orchids that bloom once a decade. He read them all in one sitting, no interruptions, no dictation, no disdain. Just that intense absorption that meant something had finally aligned. When he finished, he folded the last letter once, twice, set it on the edge of his desk and closed his eyes, not to nap, to calculate. I didn't say a word. It was one of those rare moments when the room didn't need dialogue, it needed oxygen. After a minute, he spoke. "She did not merely conceal the child," he said. "She redefined her." I leaned forward. "She did not hide the girl in distance. She hid her in plain ritual, within the Institute." Among symbols, he tapped the side of his glass. "The murders follow the path of purification, but the original sin was not doctrinal, it was domestic. Elspeth protected Bertram's name, the Institute's continuity, and in doing so, left the child suspended between mythology and secrecy." "And the killer?" "Is purging a bloodline," Wolfe said. "Not by hatred, but by symmetry." I waited. "She is the anomaly," he added. "The one who should not exist, but does." That was Wolfe's version of thunder. The next step wasn't deduction, it was naming the ghost. "She never left," Wolfe said, as if the matter had been settled by gravity rather than theory. "She was never sent away, she was absorbed." I didn't answer, it wasn't a question. "The daughter," he said, "is Prudence Khan." The syllables landed like a gavel, not a guess. I leaned back in my chair and let the pieces clink into place. It wasn't that she had been protected from scandal. She had been submerged in structure, fed ritual instead of history, shielded by a narrative so elaborate it no longer needed denial. Her presence at the Institute had always felt off, too quiet, too constant. Not absence, but omission. Wolfe reached for the letters again, his fingers tracing one line in particular. "She has your eyes, but I think mine are the ones that see through." "She was not just concealed," he said. "She was converted, turned into a living metaphor. Bertram wrote doctrine to hide his failure. Elspeth built ceremony to disguise her guilt. And now someone's killing off the variables," he nodded, "to preserve the equation." I stood and crossed to the desk. So who knows? Everyone who wanted to forget, and one who never could. Outside, the light had turned amber with the beginning of evening, and the shadows in the room lengthened toward the orchid shelves. Wolfe closed the letter. "We will speak to Prudence," he said, "but gently." For Wolfe, that was a concession. For me, it was a warning. Wolfe doesn't issue ultimatums lightly. He prefers implication over insistence, but this time he made it plain. The Institute would host a final gathering in the ritual hall, and it would happen on his terms, or not at all. "No refreshments," he said, "no music, no symbolic gestures, no exits left unmonitored." Elspeth had tried to protest. Something about dignity, tradition, appropriate tone. But Wolfe cut her off with a single lift of the hand. "This is not a ceremony," he said. "It is an inquiry disguised as a conclusion. You may keep the candles if you must, but nothing else." She'd agreed. Reluctantly, but without negotiation. Which told me she was more nervous than she let on. When Elspeth Khan ceded control of a room, it wasn't diplomacy, it was containment. Kramer agreed too, though less gracefully. He allowed Wolfe jurisdiction, as long as someone left in handcuffs. And so at precisely 7 o'clock the following evening, the same chamber that had witnessed Julian's collapse and Trillman's spiral into stillness was once again arranged. But this time, Wolfe would be the only one conducting fire. When Wolfe stood to speak, the room fell into a kind of enforced reverence, not for him, necessarily, but for the fact that he had stood at all. His vertical presence was rarer than most meteorological events, and considerably less predictable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We are gathered," he said, "not in grief, but in culmination. 4 deaths in 4 acts guided by a single doctrine, purification through structure." His hands remained folded behind his back, the only sign of tension, a slight arch in his brow. Each element, fire, wine, water, wax, was selected not for convenience but for correspondence. Julian taken after the 7th flame, Trillman drowned with fire in his mouth. The sequence is not improvised, it is deliberate. Dr. Brill had shifted in his seat. I clocked it. So did Wolfe. "This is not revenge," Wolfe went on, "nor is it madness in the common sense. It is a theological correction executed by someone who confuses metaphor with mandate." He let that sink in. "We have not been dealing with a murderer," he said, "but a student, one too faithful to the doctrine to allow its corruption by lineage or compromise." The candles flickered once. Then Wolfe stepped back, and the silence grew teeth. Wolfe turned, slowly, precisely, until he faced the chair where Dr. Brill sat frozen in that posture, peculiar to men who've just remembered something damning. "Dr. Horace Brill," Wolfe said, "your devotion to Bertram Kahn's work is not in question, nor is your grasp of its principles, but it is your application of them that makes you culpable." Brill's mouth opened, but Wolfe did not pause for him to use it. "You saw yourself as Kahn's intellectual heir and his spiritual editor. When his flesh betrayed his vision, you took it upon yourself to remove the evidence." He took one step closer. "Elspeth hid the child. Julian inherited the name. Trillman managed the money. Irene preserved the scandal. You viewed them all as stains, each tied to the fallibility of the man you idolized." Brill flinched, just once. It was enough. "You did not act from rage, but from reverence," Wolfe said. "That is what made you effective and invisible. The killer we expect is passionate. You were obedient." Brill tried to rise, didn't. "I preserved the integrity," he began.
"No," Wolfe interrupted. "You preserved a myth, and you did so by turning metaphor into execution." I saw Kramer's jaw tighten. The trap had been sprung. Wolfe waited until Brill had stopped squirming before delivering the final nail. Not theatrical, just absolute. "You left a signature?" he said. "Not by impulse. By necessity." Brill shook his head faintly. "A spiral," Wolfe continued. "Melted wax, pressed in a pattern consistent with the closing chapter of Kahn's unpublished liturgy." Brill blinked. It was not visible to the eye, not under gaslight, not beneath electric bulbs. But candlelight reveals what hides in reflection. "You chose the 7th flame deliberately, because only in its glow could the seal be seen." Brill looked up, and that was the tell, not denial, recognition. Each victim bore a sign, Julian's cuff, Trillman's throat. They were not just deaths, they were affirmations. "You were not removing people, you were consecrating a text." Kramer stepped forward. Wolfe raised a hand, not to halt him, just to finish. "You believed the spiral to be a purifying force, but it did not cleanse, it branded, and in doing so it made you legible to anyone who bothered to read." He turned toward the rest of the room. "Which, as ever, is the flaw of the scholar-turned-zealot. He forgets that knowledge is evidence, and evidence speaks louder than doctrine." Then he sat. Kramer didn't need prompting. Kramer approached like a man fulfilling a chore, not a conquest. He reached into his coat, pulled out the cuffs, and snapped them open with the efficiency of someone who didn't need to ask for permission. Brill stood, not with dignity,
but with the heavy resignation of a man who had mistaken silence for shelter. "You have the right to remain confused," Kramer muttered, looping the cuffs with a fluid click. "If you want to recite scripture on the way downtown, I suggest you make it short." Brill didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just looked at Wolfe as if expecting, or hoping for, some philosophical reprieve. He didn't get one. Kramer nodded at me. I moved to open the doors. As Brill passed, I saw his eyes shift toward the altar. Not fear, not regret, but that fatal affection reserved for ideas too long worshipped. "Damn candle cults," Kramer muttered again, mostly to himself. "And overeducated maniacs." Wolfe didn't respond. He had returned to stillness, not victorious, not triumphant, but restored, which for him was enough. The guests dispersed slowly, in low murmurs and glances not meant to be returned. The weight of exposure does strange things to people. Some shrink, others inflate. Elspeth Khan remained seated, spine straight, eyes locked on the extinguished flame as though daring it to flicker again. Wolfe rose, not fully, just enough to lean forward on the desk they'd given him. "Mrs. Khan," he said, "I will not repeat what has been made obvious." She didn't look at him. "But I will ask you this. Did you believe the secrecy would shield her, or yourself?" She didn't answer. "The tragedy is not that you concealed a child," Wolfe said quietly. "It is that you entrusted her fate to ritual instead of truth." Still nothing. "You feared scandal, so you replaced it with symbol. But symbols, madam, are not sterile. They breed consequence." Her jaw tensed just slightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cold wax. "Doctor," Brill struck the match, Wolfe concluded, "but the tinder was of your making." A silence followed, deeper than before, not hollow, carved. I watched Elspeth finally rise, take one breath, and walk away without a word. She knew better than to plead innocence. She had authored the script, even if someone else had chosen to recite it in fire. The great man had returned to his throne. It was 4:03 on a Thursday afternoon when Wolfe re-entered the brownstone and resumed his natural orientation, posterior lowered, feet elevated, and ego reclining at a 45-degree angle. He hadn't spoken since the town car pulled away from the Institute, and I hadn't pressed. Wolfe, like a boa constrictor after a satisfying meal, required silence for digestion. That the meal had involved metaphysics, murder, and social choreography didn't alter the principle. Fritz, demonstrating that mercy comes in the form of pork, emerged from the kitchen with a silver tray of beer-braised shoulder, matched by a caraway reduction that might have convinced Nero to forgive modernity. Wolfe inhaled, grunted, and permitted himself to be served. "It is a peculiar punishment," he muttered, "to be obliged to watch idiocy ornament itself with solemnity." I let that sit a moment. "You mean the murders, or the candles?" He lifted a brow without lifting his fork. "Both are votives. One seeks reverence, the other concealment. Neither achieves clarity." I poured him a bottle of the Lowenbräu Fritz had been stockpiling for the end of civilization, and he accepted it like a papal offering. "Do not speak to me of wax," Wolfe said, cutting into the pork. "It belongs either in ears or in envelopes. In neither case does it illumine." I didn't mention that he'd just solved a quadruple homicide by reading wax like scripture. Instead, I opened my own bottle and resumed my station. Elspeth Khan left without fuss, no public statement, no tears, not even a courtesy smile. The law let her go unscathed, and my opinion was doing somersaults trying to stay upright. She had paid no price beyond the weight of what she carried, and that was a burden no courtroom could quantify. I found her rise from the Institute's gathering like a shadow detaching. Gone was the satin black, gone was the calm facade. In her place stood a woman hollowed by acts that hadn't killed her, but had certainly defined her. She walked our steps to the street as though they belonged to someone else, and the door closed behind her in a way I recognized, final but unresolved. Legally, she was innocent. Morally, I wasn't so sure. I had heard Wolfe's quiet verdict, no one forces destiny without cost, but I also knew better than to argue with a legend. I sipped my beer and thought about justice. The law protects, symbolism obscures, she had orchestrated both. And while society may have forgotten in a week, we wouldn't, not here. I refilled my glass and let the dull ache of moral dissonance settle. In this room, secrets matter more than statutes. And she walked free carrying ours. Fate was delivered to our door with surgical precision. A call from Kramer. Prudence Khan had been committed to a private facility. Private, but secure. No public spectacle, no press, no statement saying she was unstable. Just a quiet retreat behind locked doors, instituted by her own mother's hands. Wolfe didn't comment. He refused the newspaper I fetched. He didn't even look up when I said, "They're burying her without ceremony." He let the words hang. Then, folding his hands as though they were instruments of logic, he said, "Custody is easier than confession." He tossed back the remainder of his beer. I understood the subtext. She would be cared for, watched, tucked away from inquiries that might breach the Institute's repairs. But more than that, her removal confirmed Wolfe's theory. Bury the living, and the dead can rest in peace. Or so they thought. I lit a cigarette, habit, not comfort, and watched the smoke rise. Silence followed, not awkward, just full. A verdict delivered without the noise of court. Word spread quickly. The sanctuary of the word was closed indefinitely. No renovation schedule, no grand reopening, just a notice on the door blaming structural issues. And all of us knew better. This was more than plaster and paint. Something had fractured irreparably. Ritual without meaning leaves dust in its place. The alumni whispered the hagiographies would continue, published, sanctified, sterilized, but no one believed the building would. It smelled of unspoken absences like churches that empty mid-rite. The staff wandered out quietly, as if afraid to disturb the echo left behind. Wolfe leaned over the papers I'd retrieved on the closure. "They bury what they cannot explain," he said. "This is not renovation, it is erasure." I nodded. It would become a footnote, a rumor site for pretentious lectures in stained-glass seminaries. But for us, it remained a crime scene, a monument to secrets buried in wax and sorrow. Fritz's food warmed the kitchen, the orchids thrived upstairs. Here, the world returned to order. But at the Institute, the dust settled over a shell. Nothing else. Dinner that evening was a muted affair. Fritz outdid himself with venison in juniper sauce and a ragout of root vegetables. I polished off my portion with care. Wolfe treated it as though each forkful were a paragraph in a treatise. He never spoke until the last bone was cleared, and that is how dinners in the brownstone usually end, with space for thought. Wolfe finally said, "Cicero wrote, 'Ritual is the lie we use to wrap guilt in lace.'" I put down my notebook. "Very Ciceronian." He nodded, not agreeing, but acknowledging we'd arrived at mutual understanding. Not harmony, another way to say tension structurally supported. "I have had a thing for ritual," he said. "Orchids, recipes, dedications, ceremony gives the world shape. But when form outlives truth, then symbols sever rather than sustain." I tapped my pen. "So what keeps the shape from snapping back?" He stared at the final embers of the candle between us, the one Fritz insisted on keeping, though I'd argued for electric bulbs and no fuss. "Honesty," he answered. "It isn't grand, it isn't decorative, but it is final." I wrote that down word for word, then I crossed it out. Not because it was untrue, but because sometimes truth, when captured, loses its silence. I closed the notebook. Wolfe sipped his wine, carafe still half full, logic fully intact, and in the quiet that followed, the candle seemed to tremble, as though uncertain if it had done its duty. Final line. The seventh candle burned out, but the shadows it cast still danced across every wall. In the end, it wasn't the spiral of wax or the number of candles that unraveled the truth. It was the quiet weight of the past pressed into letters no longer read and guilt too carefully curated. Wolfe, ever the immovable force, lifted the veil not with passion, but with precision, and left the rest of us, myself included, wondering whether some truths are solved or simply exposed. One man struck the match, yes, but how many stood nearby with oil in their hands? Would you have drawn the line where Wolfe did, or let the sins of yesterday dissolve in silence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.